Hello, Colleen and Lauren. This is Les Detterbeck, and I'm actually in my office. It's Saturday. We had a really good seminar in Chicago a week ago and one here in Charleston on Wednesday. Unfortunately, our recording equipment didn't work as well as I had hoped. I didn't like the sound. So what you're getting now is I'm sitting here in my office on a Saturday, and I'm going to go through the workbook with you and give you kind of an overview on how that all comes together. So let me start with pages 1 and the first 2 slides. We've been getting a lot of questions this year about the markets and how people are feeling about their money. As you know, money and emotions are completely inseparable. Gosh, we've got a client who's 95 who, when she wakes up in the morning, before she has her cup of coffee, goes to the computer and goes into her accounts, makes sure that she has enough money for the day and the rest of her life. I can assure you that she has more than enough money, but she just feels good making sure that everything's okay. 2015, as we've discussed, Colleen, has been a fairly flat month, flat year so far. And actually now equities for the first time in the last part of October have gone slightly into the positive territory. So all of us hate to lose, and we hate to lose with money. And when that happens, we don't feel so good. The other thing that occurs is that we all have a hardwired bias called recency bias, which means that we attach a lot more importance to things that happen in the near term past than those over a longer term. And so when we have a tough year like 2015, people start to think, is that going to continue forever? So we've received questions like the first slide, will I have enough money for the rest of my life? Or maybe I should put part of my money in my mattress. Another way of saying those is if you're a young person and you're saving for future independence, the question is, how am I ever going to put away enough money to be able to be financially independent and retire? So we're getting these kinds of questions, and those two things are what we're going to be talking about today. The second slide shows you an overview of the seminar. It shows you what we'll be looking at and what we looked at as far as last 12 months, the view from a longer perspective over the last 7 decades, expected returns going forward, some key metrics, because investment management is only one piece of the puzzle. And then look at it, some emotional biases in investing, who can help, and what some of the programs are there. So I'll quickly run through these and give you guys kind of an update as you're going through the workbook. If you turn the page and look at the next page 2 of the workbook, we'll be talking about 3 income classes, which would be equities, fixed income, and alternatives. Again, Colleen, you don't use alternatives, and we understand that you basically have equities and fixed income. And the indices we use are the All-Cap World Index, because that represents a diversified portfolio, as well as the Barclays Capital Aggregate Bond Index, which again is a diversified portfolio. The last 12 months return in the bottom of that page shows you that all asset classes have gone different directions along the last 12 months, but they're all pretty close to zero at this stage. And if we turn the next page, we'll see the year-to-date is even more that way, with 2015, with the reds being the equities that went way up, and then they went down, then they came back. The alternatives went up a little bit, came back, and then fixed income is still just a little bit negative. The challenge is in August, where people weren't feeling good at all, because as you can see the red line in the middle chart, equities went down considerably, and there were a lot of people whose emotions said, let's get out of the stock market. Of course, Colleen, you're very disciplined, and I know you are not one of those that contacted us, or one that I was concerned about, because you know in the long run that that's the place to be. And as you see in October, in the last slide on page 3, what happened with equities is they came back almost 10% in the month of October. The next page, page 4, we talked a little bit about pullbacks and corrections. We've had 19 pullbacks or corrections. That is a reduction in the value of the equity markets between 5 and 10% in the last 6 years, from 2009 until now. And even in the last 12 months, we've had a number of those. But that's part of the process. After that, we looked at, if you'll see on the workbook, page 5, we looked at some really key features, which are inflation, the gross domestic product, and the stock market total returns. And what we wanted to do was to look at those and step back from all the media hype that we all get day to day, and talk about really, if we go back a number of decades, what are likely prospects for growth, inflation, and stock market returns for the near future. So the bottom caption on page 5 is a look at inflation, and you see that back in the 70s and 80s that inflation was much higher than it was today. It's only running about 1.5% per year. Lots of things fueled that inflation back in the 70s and 80s, including the baby boomers going to work, and of course so many women who went into the marketplace for the first time, and that created a huge amount of growth. It involved increasing wages, high consumer confidence. Many households had 2 incomes rather than 1. There was a lot of consumption, and all of those things helped drive inflation up. Again, I remember back in 1980, we bought a house and paid 15% on our mortgage for that house. And that seemed like an awful lot of money, but you did that sort of thing because you thought prices were always going to go up, which of course is not the case. So let's look at workbook page 6, and you can see that the causes of inflation, as I had mentioned, are the economic growth, low unemployment, consumer confidence, rising wages, higher import costs. All of those things are not occurring today. Economic growth is lower. Yes, we have low unemployment, but we have a fair amount, over 6 million people that are underemployed, either part-time or have left the job market. Therefore, wages are not yet rising. In fact, real wages are the same value that they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Consumer confidence is lower, and because of the high and strong U.S. dollar, import costs are not higher these days, they're lower. Lastly, government debt has gone up appreciably in the last 16 years. Government debt now is roughly the same as our gross domestic product, or $18 trillion. And only 16 years ago, it was just 50% of gross domestic product. So anyway, what all of that means that our Fed has printed more dollars, but that hasn't produced necessarily any additional interest at this point in time. So you can then see in the middle of workbook page 6 the growth in inflation over the last 7 decades. You see that we had some very nice growth in the 50s and 60s, good growth in the 70s and 80s, although it wasn't as much real growth because of inflation, and then growth has been coming down since that time. The S&P total returns, as you can see, were wonderful in the 50s, and then they oftentimes, as you know, stock market returns get carried away one way or the other. The pendulum moves too much to one side and then moves too much to the other. So after a huge year in the 50s, huge years in the 50s, the 60s and 70s were frankly fairly low in terms of overall stock market returns as compared to inflation and real growth. Real growth is real GDP. That also then we came through with another, the 80s and 90s were great for stocks, pretty good for growth, a decent inflation, and some really nice excess returns for equities. But the 2000s and the first 5 and plus years this part have not done nearly so well, and so we're only really in terms of the excess equity premium. which is the total equity return minus inflation minus the change in real growth, really hasn't been up over the last 16 years. So we look at that and say, well, what does that all mean? And where is growth currently headed? And you see page 7 and the chart that shows that real growth in the U.S. is going down. And therefore, we want to talk about what this all means. There's a professor from Northwestern, which we refer to on the bottom slide on page 5, Dr. Robert Gordon, who has studied economic growth over the last 5 centuries and concluded first that through 1750 there was never any real economic growth. It was only at the time that we had the first industrial revolution in Europe and the UK, which was 1750 to 1830, that we had some real growth with the invention of steam engines and locomotives. And that was followed by the Industrial Revolution #2, which was primarily centered in the US at the turn of the century, which included planes, cars, electricity, communication, and refrigeration, all of which employed tons of millions of workers and really pushed the economy in a big way, where people came off the farms, came into the cities. The refrigeration allowed air conditioning, and we had huge growth in that period of time, much of which carried over all the way into the 1960s and 70s. The last industrial revolution is started in 1960 with computers, and frankly hasn't had near the impact. Though we've got the internet and e-commerce, what we don't have is the big number of increased U.S. workers as a result of this technology. And therefore, what's happening is that some of the things that really drove growth in the 20th century aren't as prevalent today. Those would include demographics, with the baby boomers now retiring. Yes, women, as I mentioned, got into the workforce, but they're already in the workforce. We don't have a third gender that's prepared to come in and give us a big shot in the arm with economic growth. We have a shorter work day than we had before, and actually the automation helped us in 1996 through 2004, but isn't adding appreciably to the production output percentage increases these days. Education is not what it used to be. Our country, both high school grads and college grads, are falling behind the other economic developed countries. We also can look at inequality, which is hurting the middle class in a big way. In the 20th century, the middle class really pushed our economy. They were making good dollars, good income, and spending it. And that's a tougher deal for so many people these days. And the debt, as I mentioned, is a lot higher. So not only do we have this kind of black cloud in terms of federal debt that at some point in time we're going to have to be paying big interest payments on, but we have unfunded pensions across the country. And of course, we have places like Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, other state and local governments that are having difficulties. So the result is that it's unlikely with those headwinds that we're going to have big increases in growth unless we get some amazing new technological changes that change that. On a world basis, at the bottom of page 8, you can see that the U.S. Real growth is less than the world real growth. The emerging market countries like India, China, Brazil, Russia, and others are making progress. And of course, with their quantity of billions of people, you know, that makes quite a difference. That's one of the main reasons why we really push for diversification in terms of investments, because the emerging markets is an area that we want to be in. So then we move to the last 100 years, and you can see on page 9 the graph. And the key thing on the page 9 graph, these are all the bull markets and bear markets over the last 100 years. And it's quite obvious to see that the bull markets in blue far outweigh the bear markets in red. Though the bear markets are horrible to go through, we all hate them, the fact is that they're typically much shorter in duration, and the extent that they have on the markets is much less than